Tens of thousands of Muslims left their home countries to join ISIS. Many of them eventually returned to their home countries. Quite frequently, prosecutors in their home countries had no idea what these men and women did when they were with ISIS. Were they slaughtering Shias or were they cooking falafel? Prosecutors often didn't know. So the returning ISIS jihadis would end up serving 5-year or 7-year or 10-year sentences for some vague crime. This means that many ISIS jihadis will be released back into society. Many of them have already been released back into society. Now, how do you know that the ISIS jihadi you're releasing back into society isn't going to go on a killing spree? Easy. You know he's as gentle as a jelly bean because while he was in prison, you made him participate in a deradicalization program. You showed him that the Quran says there's no compulsion in religion and that, contrary to what Muslim scholars say, this definitely wasn't abrogated, and that when Allah said, fight those who don't believe in Allah, and when Muhammad said, if anyone leaves Islam, kill him, they just didn't mean what they said. But how effective are these de-radicalization programs? Do they really work? Can they really melt the cold heart of an ISIS jihadi? Let's ask a former ISIS jihadi who's currently in prison. Last week, I posted a video about Musa Cerantonio, an Australian convert to Islam who became one of the world's leading propagandists for ISIS. He's proficient in several languages, including Aramaic, and after studying an Aramaic legend about Alexander the Great, Musa realized that the Quran was plagiarized from earlier myths and legends. He's now an atheist and a fan of Richard Dawkins. An article about him in The Atlantic gives Musa's perspective on de-radicalization programs. From The Atlantic. Whenever a prominent member of a terror group leaves it, he inspires a great deal of curiosity about how he was cured of his evil beliefs, which seem so durable when they are held that they may lead to violent death. So much of Cerantonio's story is idiosyncratic that I'm not sure what, if anything, can be used to deprogram others. Most ISIS supporters care little about the historical and linguistic minutiae that motivated Cerantonio. Teaching jihadists Aramaic is not a cure easily scaled up. Moreover, a rehab program that encourages patients to give up Islam, a religion practiced benignly by nearly all Muslims, instead of merely giving up terrorism, is bound to be controversial. So, according to the people in charge, it's okay for a rehab program to tell a jihadi that Allah and Muhammad didn't actually command their followers to violently subjugate the world, but it's not okay to tell a jihadi that Muhammad was a fake prophet. You can lie to a jihadi about his religion, but you can't tell him to reject his religion. Cerantonio himself said that the programs in prisons in Australia and abroad are almost all rubbish. They raise objections to jihadism that the jihadists can easily refute. He called the suggestion that jihadists be exposed to true Islam, such as the more moderate texts of medieval theologians, idiotic. It doesn't work, he told me. It has failed miserably time after time. But he is equally withering about Dawkins' polemics against Islam, even though he now shares Dawkins' zero-calorie theology. I'm no longer a Muslim, he said, but I still object to the things he's saying. When he writes about Islam, he gets things wrong. Dawkins quotes a scripture that claims martyrs will be given 72 virgins in paradise. That hadith is not authentic, Cerantonio said with frustration. Dawkins, you're smart. You do so much research. Why couldn't you do just a little research on this? Opponents of ISIS, even smart ones, suddenly make themselves stupid when combating jihadism and assume, wrongly, that the jihadists themselves are stupid. So, the de-radicalization programs are almost all rubbish. Jihadists can easily refute them. The idea that you're going to show jihadis the true, peaceful Islam is idiotic. It doesn't work. It has failed miserably time after time. This is coming from a former ISIS jihadi. And yet, De-radicalization programs are the go-to solution for Western nations dealing with returning ISIS jihadis. What are Western nations doing about the returning ISIS jihadis who are being released back into Western society? They're putting the jihadis through de-radicalization programs that are, according to a former ISIS jihadi, absolutely idiotic. As for the complaint about Dawkins, it is important to realize that just because you like someone for some expertise in his field, this doesn't mean you should trust everything he says on every topic. Richard Dawkins is an evolutionary biologist. That's his area of expertise. Why in the name of common sense would you trust everything he says in other areas? In Dawkins' defense, however, even though there are weak hadiths that refer to jihadis getting 72 virgins, and I'm not sure which hadith Cerantonio is referring to, they're not all weak. For instance, here's a hadith from Jami at-Tirmidhi that mentions 72 wives in paradise, and it's graded Hasan, or good. You're welcome, Richard Dawkins. When Cerantonio now meets jihadists, he told me they are numerous and unrepentant in Australian prisons, he experiments with different approaches. I can actually speak to hardcore jihadists on a level that they understand, he said. At times, the approach that has worked is not even a coherent one. He described convincing two jihadists by explaining to them the mechanisms of evolution. In effect, he told me, he just went at them hard and outlined, without condescension, how a world without a divine creator might look, how it made sense, and how it might be an alternative to their current beliefs. Both of them have drastically changed their lives, he claimed. They now denounce everything they were standing for before. I mean, they were planning to carry out a terrorist attack here in Melbourne, blow themselves up in a public square. Now, he said, they're not religious at all. I thought, wow, I mean, surely it can't always be that easy. But who knows? Maybe it is. So, he presented an alternative worldview to them, one that's inconsistent with their own worldview, and that was enough to undermine their confidence in Islam and convince them not to go through with their planned suicide attack in a public square in Melbourne. It was so easy for Cerantonio that he had to pause and think to himself, it can't be that easy. And what is the one thing that Western governments will never do when they have jihadis in custody? The one thing that Western governments will never do when they have jihadis in custody is give the jihadis any reason to question their religion. Your safety and the safety of your family and friends is in the hands of cowards and morons. On a related note, what do? What does the apostate prophet do? What do we and many others like us do on our channels? We give jihadis reasons to question their religion. And we're condemned for it, even though it works. Some final thoughts from the journalist. Last year in Saudi Arabia, I visited a prison that purported to deprogram jihadists by turning them into productive employees of a small business, complete with a CEO, himself a prisoner, an HR department, and a controller. I couldn't tell how successful the prison's strategy would be. All of the prisoners were still in jail and subject to who knows what punishment if they lapsed. Beyond any doubt, however, is the failure of virtually every previous attempt to deprogram jihadists. So far, nothing seems to have worked better than defeating ISIS on the battlefield, reducing its caliphate to rubble, and inviting its followers to consider whether God might be sending them a message in the form of U.S. aerial bombardment. But drone strikes are expensive. Maybe Aramaic is worth a try. Now, that sounds like a joke, but he just made a very important point. We have to deal with jihadis. We can deal with them while they're waging jihad, but that's expensive, not just in terms of drone strikes, but also in terms of human life. Dealing with jihadis while they're waging jihad is bad for everyone. But there's another way to deal with jihadis. You can deal with them before they wage jihad by convincing them that Islam just isn't worth dying for because it's not true. Musa Cerantonio's knowledge of Aramaic helped him realize that Muhammad was a plagiarist and a false prophet. We can't really expect other jihadis to learn Aramaic so that they too can realize that Muhammad was a plagiarist and a false prophet. But there are lots of other ways to expose the Quran. There are lots of other ways to expose Muhammad. So, we can either deal with jihadis peacefully by showing them that Islam is false before they launch their attacks, or we can deal with them after they've started their bloodbaths. Who's pursuing a peaceful solution here? Critics of Islam, critics of the Quran, critics of Muhammad. Critics are pursuing a peaceful solution by trying to convince jihadis that Muhammad was a false prophet. Who's leading us towards an endless cycle of violence? The politicians and journalists and educators and entertainers and dawagandists who silence the critics. Whose side are you on? Be sure to subscribe.
It just backfired on you. It just backfired on you. This is a part of a religion. There's a reason to it. Yeah?